welcome back to Indie Rebel, the podcast for independent filmmakers. My name is Christopher Temple. I am your host, and today we're going to be talking all about computers. Next to your camera, the computer is really the most important piece of gear that you have in your arsenal. And I'm not just talking about, from a screenwriting standpoint. We've already kind of talked about that before on another episode, but really from a post-production standpoint. Like we talked about in the episode about cameras, if you can't do anything with your footage, like what's the point? You've got to have a pipeline, you've got to have a workflow in place and a way to get your image up from your sensor to whatever viewing platform you intend to go to. So we're going to be focusing on computers from that angle today. And really your biggest consideration when you do this is figuring out what editing software, or what NLE stands for non-linear editor, which one of those you want to pick. Currently there's, probably about 4 big ones. You've got Avid Media Composer, you've got DaVinci Resolve, you've got Adobe Premiere, and you've got Final Cut. Those are your big ones. There are smaller ones below that. You've also got things like Vegas, CapCut, iMovie, really basic kind of stuff like that. So really, you're going to be picking from one of those top 4. If you're on a Mac, any of those options are available for you. Avid, Resolve, Premiere, or Final Cut. But Final Cut is Apple only. It only runs on Macs. So if you're going to be using a Windows platform, then that is out of the running. So do some research, figure out what software you want to use. I recommend people use DaVinci Resolve. I'm a total shill for it now. One, I love the Blackmagic cameras, but DaVinci is truly unmatched in this industry when it comes to color and working with colors in your software. There are other softwares out there, like Baselight comes to mind and that kind of a thing. But really, DaVinci is king, and that's what it started life as. And then Blackmagic bought them out and started adding adding video editing functions. And then they added a professional sound editor in there with a Fairlight page. And then they added, pro end visual effects with Fusion. And so now it's a really good, robust, all-in-one system. And there's a free version out there that will do pretty much whatever you need it to do to shoot your own small movie. There are some stuff missing in the free one, but it's stuff that you can probably do without, especially for your first film. Now, if you wanted the free or the paid version with all the extra features, you're looking for the studio version of that license, and that runs $300. So still super affordable. And if you buy a Blackmagic camera, which I'm also a sucker for, you get the pro version of the software for free anyway, which is cool. But I'm starting to get ahead of myself here. I want to backtrack just real quick here. Talking about, a writing computer versus an editing computer, you can do it all on the same computer. If your laptop is powerful enough, you can edit your movie on the laptop. But I would recommend having 2 computers and having one be your writing computer, one be your editing computer. Your editing computer can be a writing computer, but a writing computer may not be able to be an editing computer, if that makes any sense. In fact, I did that for years. I went through a period where I had my desktop PC, which I didn't build. I bought it from Best Buy back in 2003, and I gimped it along for almost 10 years. And that was my editing computer, and then I always had some sort of laptop with me so I could write wherever I wanted to write. And these days I do exactly the same thing. Currently, my setup is I have a M2 MacBook Air that I run my business off of, so that's got my QuickBooks. It also allows me to do all my pre-production. So it's got screenwriting. It's got my own custom scheduling app that I've designed called Cineschedule, and we can talk more about that in another episode and how I used AI tools to build that. It's got my emails, my calendars, all that kind of stuff. I do all my marketing from it. So my laptop runs the business side and the pre-production side. And then for editing, I have a custom-built PC that I made. And I'll talk about my specs here in just a minute. Now, the reason, kind of, again, coming full circle here, the reason why I mention choosing what software you want to use first is so you can make sure that whatever computer you either buy or build can conform to that. And I do recommend DaVinci Resolve. However, it's one of the most resource intensive apps out there for video editing. So if you're on a Mac and you want to use the Mac platform, you need at minimum Mac OS 14 Sonoma or later. You need 8 gigs of memory or 16 if you're planning to use Fusion. And then it needs to be an Apple Silicon based processor. So basically your M1, M2, and so on. That's what's going to run the latest versions of DaVinci Resolve. Now, if you're on Windows, you get a little bit more flexibility. And we'll talk more about why this could be important for you in just a minute. But if you're on Windows, you need at least the Windows 10 Creator Update. You need 16 gigs of memory, or 32 if you're planning to use Fusion. And then you'll need a external GPU or a third-party GPU as well that supports OpenCL 1.2 or CUDA 12.8. And you'll need to make sure that then you've got your drivers for that and stuff like that. So it can be a little bit more cumbersome to try to get this working on Windows and making sure all of your components are going to play nice together. But you do have the opportunity to build a much more powerful computer if you're willing to go the Windows route for editing. Now, the other cool thing about DaVinci is it does also run on Linux. I'm not going to go over what the specs for that are. I'm not an expert in that field at all. I know of a guy over in Georgia, I think it is, Georgia or Alabama. His name's Micah Pendleton. Great dude, runs a business called Caution Glass. And his entire thing is like ran on Linux. So, and they're doing web design and marketing and video editing and all sorts of cool stuff completely on Linux. And that's because DaVinci Resolve also does run on Linux. And so if you are a die-head, FOSS guy, free and open source software, and that's what you want to do, again, Resolve is probably going to be your best option for doing something like that. Now let's talk about my computer real quick. So I told you I've got an M2 MacBook Air that I'm using to run my business off of. For video editing, I built a computer. It's an i9 processor, so an Intel i9, 64 gigs of RAM, and then it's got an RTX 3090 built into it. And that was graciously donated by a friend and former coworker. He upgraded his to the 4090s, and so he had a 3090 kicking around. He asked if I wanted to use it for Leap, and I said yes. And so I actually tried to stick it into my previous computer. I was running an HP Z800 with 24 or 32 gigs of RAM, and that had a GeForce 1060 in it, a 6 gig 1060. So I tried to put this 3090 in, and it didn't want to fit into the case. And so I decided I needed to build a computer from scratch, and I built it based upon DaVinci. I knew if I could run DaVinci and run it well, all my other software, and we'll talk about what other software I run, all that would run, no problem. Now, talking about laptops versus desktops, this is kind of the other thing that you need to consider. So it's not just Windows, Mac, or Linux, but laptop or desktop. I love laptops for their portability, and I can do quick client edits for some basic shoots on my laptop too. Or I can cut together a quick behind the scenes video or mock up a visual effect if I want to test something out in the field. I can do that on my MacBook Air. But really, at the end of the day, for good editing and to have good performance and to do all the stuff that's involved with post-production, having that standalone desktop PC just gives you so much more bang for your buck. And so I do recommend having a standalone PC or a desktop for editing. Even if you decide to stay on the Mac platform, just having that standalone workstation is going to do wonders for you. Now, if you decide to go with a standalone desktop for your editing computer, you've got two schools of thought. You can either build your own, or you can buy a pre-built gaming or multimedia computer. And I would recommend going the gaming route if that's the way you want to go, if you don't want to build it yourself. Gaming PCs, because they require a lot of computing power, their specs are normally going to be on par with what we need as filmmakers as well. And I think last I looked, you can get on Amazon, and for between $1,300 and $1,500, get a pretty nice, gaming PC. I think they're called like CyberPower or something like that. And they're budget. They're not going to be made of quality components, but it's going to do the job for you. But something to consider is for that same cost minus a graphics card, you could build your own with much higher quality components. It's going to last you a lot longer. There's the satisfaction of knowing, hey, you built it yourself, and you can be swapping pieces out and stuff as things go bad over the years and make slow and incremental upgrades to it. Just know that there's going to be a little bit of a learning curve. You're going to need to do your homework, watch a lot of videos on how to build a PC, make sure everything plays together. Pick your processor and how much RAM you want, and then make sure you get a motherboard that can support all of that. And and then you need to make sure you've got room in the case, like, for your GPU and the cooler. Gosh, the cooler is so important. I have fried computers in the past trying to make films. I was doing a movie where the computer was getting so hot I had to pull off the side of the tower and blast a fan into the thing just to keep the components cool enough because I didn't have a good enough cooling system built into it. When it comes to your cooling system, you really can't go wrong with a good fan setup. I've got a massive one. I think it's called Noctura or something. I don't know the brand. I'm not a total computer nerd, but and it was totally the biggest cooler I could find. It is a fan. It's not water cooled. You could go water cooled if you wanted, but it was like the highest rated, fan base cooling setup I could find. And man, the thing is a monster. So then I had to make sure that I had a case that could fit all this too. And let me tell you, it just barely fit into the case that I bought. So really do your homework and do your research and make sure that everything is going to work together and interface properly. For instance, certain motherboards can only use certain types of hard drives. And I didn't know that going into that. And I actually had to change some things around because I realized I'd bought the wrong components. Or certain processors will only work with certain hard drives as well too. And that was another instance I'd ran into where I bought an i9 processor, but it was like 3 or 4 years old and it couldn't write to M.2 drives. And I bought an M.2 thinking, well, this will save me a lot of room. And I ended up having to go to just a regular SSD drive instead because of the older processor that I'd picked. And I have no regrets about it. Everything's been running just fine. I'm not going to need to build a new computer for at least another 5 years at this point. It does everything I need it to do, and I know that I can upgrade the GPU and the RAM down the road too if I want to. With this as well, you're also going to want to make sure that you have a power supply that can give enough juice to everything. And so that's another consideration that you want. I think I've got a 100 or a 1000 watt power supply. I'd have to go double check my specs, but it's pretty high up there. You're not going to want, a 500 or 600. That's just not going to cut it. Speaking of, requirements here too, the other thing you need to consider when you're doing this is your storage requirements, hard drives especially. And you need a operating system drive, and you're also going to need at least 2 other drives that you're storing your footage on. Now, I like using external hard drives for this because they're portable and it's easy to clone, and then I can take and separate them and keep them apart. So that way I've always got a good backup of stuff. And really, if you're going to do that, you probably need to have 3 drives, but you can get away with 2 of them. So here's what you need to do. You need to, first of all, calculate how much hard drive you actually need to store all your footage. And it's not just, excuse me, not just storing your footage, but also all the other files that you create while making a film, all your project files, all the media caches. If you're doing a lot of visual effects work, guess what? You need clean plates, you need final passes, you need tracking plates. You're gonna have caches for your visual effects software as well too. If you're doing fluid simulations, that's got its own set of caches that it needs. And so really you're gonna need a lot of space. So I always start with, okay, what are my shooting requirements? How much space do I need to shoot? And I like kind of going off of a 5-to-1 shooting ratio. I know a lot of times I'm only gonna get 1 take of something, but there's gonna be other times where I might do, 8 takes of something just to get it the way I want it to be. So I average a 5-to-1 shooting ratio. So if your movie's gonna be 90 minutes long, you multiply that by 5 and you get 490 minutes. Now what you got to do is figure out how much storage space you can get on your memory card that you're filming with. And so I know for me, I don't shoot more than an hour of footage per day, typically. And so I have 3 128 GB cards for my Ursa Mini 4K. Each 128 gig card, when shooting in RAW 4-to-1 compression, gets me a recording time of 22 minutes. So I've got 3 cards that gets me 66 minutes of recording during the day. So now I just go into ChatGPT. I say, if 128 gigabytes equals 22 minutes, how much storage do I need to store 490 minutes? And then the calculation it gave me from there was something like 2.7. So let's round it up to 3 terabytes. And so I knew then that I needed 3 terabytes at minimum just to handle the raw footage from my camera. And then you start getting into all the working footage and your rough cuts and stuff like that, and making sure you've got plenty of room for sims and caches and stuff. And so I ended up buying two 8 terabyte drives. I mounted them as X and Y on my computer, and they're complete clones. We'll talk about how I do that here in a second. And with 8 terabytes of storage and about 3 terabytes of actual footage, when all was said and done, I used just around 7 terabytes to complete my last film. So I had 1 terabyte free. I'm okay with that. I don't need to cut it down to the wire. In fact, I prefer to have a little extra space to work with rather than not have enough. So for my feature, which is 84 minutes long, 8 terabytes was perfect for me. And like I said, I had two of them. I call them X and Y because it's so far down that list on the Windows hierarchy that they're never going to get overwritten. X will always be X, Y will always be Y. Then I use a piece of software called Free File Sync to keep those drives synchronized. And so Free File Sync is completely free. You open it up and you can basically put a target on one side and a target on the other. So I say I want to look at drives X and Y. Then you scan them, and then it finds any differences between your two drives and then copies the changes over, and it will tell you what it's wanting to do. So you can just kind of scroll through and make sure you're not removing something that you shouldn't be removing. But this is how you keep things synchronized, and it has saved my butt on every single movie I've ever done. And I've done 4 of them, finished 4 of them. Something always goes wrong and I have to pull from a backup. In the old days, it was pulling from my mini DV tapes. Those were my backups, right? But once I went tapeless and I started using, memory cards, I've always had 2 hard drives, and I've had to, at some point, make a recovery. In fact, on this last movie, Leap, I had a drive completely fail. My X drive completely crapped out on me. And fortunately, I'd been making my copies, my backups at the end of every editing session. Boom, clone the drive. Just, it's part of your workflow every day. And I was able to buy a new hard drive, clone from Y to the new X, and I was back in business and back up and running again. So really cannot stress that enough. So what are you looking at cost-wise to put your editing system together? Well, the software's free, right? So that's good. Really, you're looking at components and your storage. I think it is more than possible for you to have a complete editing system. If you didn't build it yourself, let's say you bought a prefabbed one, you're looking at easily less than $2,000 to have something good and to have all your hard drives and stuff like that. Now, if you're going to go the Mac route, I don't recommend doing it on the laptops. I really, really don't. Cutting a feature on these laptops is insane. Like, you don't want to do it. If you decide that you're going to, you're looking at between $1,000 and $2,000 on up for your MacBook, depending on which one you get. And then, of course, your hard drives as well on top of it. Plan on about $100 to $120 a pop for your external hard drives at this point in time. Of course, prices are always changing and things like that too. Other hardware considerations is going to be your monitor. Okay, you want to make sure you've got a decent monitor, at least full HD, if not higher. And I recommend, I'm torn on it. I used to like the dual monitor setup. And I think today, if I were to do it again, and I'm actually planning to do this, I'm going to buy an ultra wide curved display. Make sure you've got some good height to it. 12 inches tall is not enough. You need to be 14 to 20 inches high, but then get a really ultra wide. I think that would work just fine. And I would go that route myself now. But the one thing I would absolutely consider doing is getting a TV, and a small TV. You can get them at Walmart. Just get an HD TV, doesn't need to be 4K, and use that as your preview monitor. I've got mine mounted to the wall. I wish I could show you guys a photo of my office here on a podcast, but I can't. You'd have to go check out my YouTube channel for that. But I've got a TV mounted just above my computer tower up to the wall. And then I've got my two other monitors that I'm working off of. Plus, I usually have my laptop there as well too. But the nice part about having a TV as a preview is that it doesn't matter if I'm editing in DaVinci or I'm doing effects in Nuke. I've got this dedicated preview monitor showing me what my final output is of whatever it is that I'm working on. So I'm not constantly having to toggle a full screen mode from within my editing software all the time. So if you can afford it, highly recommend doing that. That was probably one of the best investments I made on this film when I built my setup for all this. Also, you want to consider your speaker system. Obviously, if you're planning to do something really high end, you're going to want to get a 5.1 setup and hook that up to the computer, and then you got mapping all your channels around all that kind of stuff and doing that. You can totally do that, and I've been a part of productions that have done that. But for myself personally, with the scope and the scale of the movies I'm currently making, I think a stereo mix is just fine. I've got stereo speakers with a subwoofer, so it's technically a 2.1, and that's nice to get me those low bass ends so I can actually hear decently what it's going to sound like. And then whenever I'm doing a test screening or I want to just go watch my rough cut, very rarely will I actually sit at the computer and watch it all the way through like that. I will typically render out a file and then jump into my living room here at the house where I've got the 65-inch TV and I throw it on there with a good sound system. And then that way I'm watching it in a more ideal environment. And I find sitting at the couch with a notepad turns me more into a viewer than the technical focused filmmaker, and I can actually watch the rough cut of the film for what it actually is. So a little pro tip there. I'm sure that's one I'll mention again when we start talking about editing in another podcast down the road, but this is all just about the equipment and the things that you need to kind of make this all work. Also, very, 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 very important, your surge protector. Don't use those little strips you get at Home Depot or Walmart or whatever, just a basic power strip. That, yes, it's going to protect your computer from a surge, but what you really want, especially if you live in the boonies like I do, I live in, the mountains of Montana where we can lose power sometimes for days on end. I want to make sure if I'm working and the power goes out that I don't lose anything. I don't want anything to get corrupted or anything like that. And so what I do is I've bought it's a UPS, Universal Power Supply. It's a battery backup. It costs a few $100s, but what it does is you plug that into the wall and then you plug all your computer stuff into it. And one side is dedicated as a battery backup and the other side is just a basic surge protector. So I keep my computer, one monitor, and the at least one hard drive plugged into the battery side. And then everything else can go wherever. I don't care about the other stuff. The other hard drive, the other monitors, that can all just go into the surge protector side. And I had this happen. The power went out. Most of my monitors died except for my main monitor, my computer, and the one hard drive. That allowed me to save my project, save what I was working on, and then manually shut everything down. And then when the power came back on, then I rebooted the computer. Everything's back up and running, and I did ran the file sync to make sure that the both hard drives got back in sync again. And then I was off and running, and there were no issues. So those backup power supplies are really worth their weight in gold. And especially if you're going to spend, I mean, think about it, if you're spending the money on the computer and you're pouring all this sweat and blood and tears into your film, and like you're so emotionally invested in this thing, I would hate to see that you just lose it because of a power supply or something, right? Surge or power flickers off and you lose everything because the computer shuts down. It's like, oh man, I can't even imagine. So at least use a strip, at the very, very least. That'll protect your computer, but if you want to protect the film, get the battery backup. Can't stress that enough. Okay, a few more things before we get ready to wrap up here. This has been able to be a shorter episode, which I think is good. It makes it more digestible for you and stuff too that way. I want to add a kind of a key point that I think is important that not a lot of people do anymore today because so much software is subscription based. But I keep my computer completely offline. My editing computer, I should say, is completely offline unless it needs to validate a license. So even if I'm doing client work on it, when I'm done and I'm ready to upload to YouTube, I put that on a thumb drive, I bring it over to my MacBook, and I upload it and do all that from the MacBook. I will not put that computer, my editing computer, on the internet unless it needs to do a license validation. And my reasoning for that is because I've had a virus come through and wipe me out near the end of post production, and I had to restart everything again from scratch. And it was just a total and complete nightmare. And so I don't do it. That computer is completely offline. So what that means is I need to make sure I use as much as possible software that I can own outright without it needing to validate more than, 3 or 4 times a year. And I've actually got a pretty good setup for that. Although I think Photoshop requires more validation, but I hardly ever use it on that computer. Most of my Photoshop work I actually do on the laptop anyway. So let's talk about software real quick. We've already talked about DaVinci Resolve, okay, as your main editor. Other creative software I highly recommend would be Nuke or Fusion Studio. Now, this is if you've got the studio version of Resolve. If you've got the studio version of Resolve, Fusion Studio comes free with that as a standalone application. It's like the Fusion page, but a lot more powerful and a lot more stable, I've found. The Fusion page inside of Resolve is great for your first feature and all your short films. That'll do just fine for you. I'm just letting you know what's on my system. All right. So you've got Resolve, that's got your visual effects handled, it's got your sound mix handled, and your color and your editing. I like using Nuke for my compositing. It's just I'm good, I'm fast with it, and I think it works better than Fusion. That said, I also have Fusion Studio. There are certain things that are easier to do in Fusion, so I have the standalone version for that. Although I think back when I think on my movie, there are a few Fusion shots in Leap, but they were all done on the Fusion page. I never actually used Fusion Studio for that. All the major visual effects were done with Nuke. With visual effects, you're also going to want some photo editor. Okay, I like Photoshop. Again, it's what I know, and I've not been willing to take the time to learn something new, like Affinity. So unfortunately, that is a subscription, but I get 2 licenses with that, and I run it on my laptop as well. So that works out just fine. And then Blender for any CGI, computer graphics. Okay, I've been using Blender for over 20 years now, and it's great. And then I do have After Effects, and I use After Effects for 2 things. I will use it for MoGraph. So if I wanted to do like a James Bond style title sequence at the beginning of my film, I might use After Effects for that. But what I use it for the most and what I used it for on my film was the Roto Brush. And this was only, I think, After Effects CS6 is what I've got on there again because I want to keep it offline. So I've got an old CS6 license that I still use, and I use the Roto Brush. And then what I do is I render that out as a black and white image, a black and white pass, and I bring that into Nuke or Fusion to handle the rotoing. Now, Fusion Studio just came out with Magic Mask version 2, and that's the kind of their answer to Roto Brush. So I'm excited to play with that and see, because if I could get away with not needing After Effects anymore for Roto, I would love to just dump it from the system. I don't use After Effects for anything really other than Roto. And there is pro Roto software out there that you can use called Silhouette, but After Effects is just, it's fast, it's easy, it's not as manual, and that works out well for me. Other pieces of software that you might not think about would be your music creation side of things. Now, if you're on a Mac, that's easy. You've got GarageBand, you can get Logic for $300, so that makes it really nice. But if you're wanting this on a PC, then I recommend looking into Mixcraft. And I've been using Mixcraft for about 15 years as well now. You can get a MIDI keyboard, hook it up, and now you can actually be composing and writing score for your films, either note by note or using loops, which is really cool. And then there's other ones out there. You got Cubase. What are some of the other ones? Digital Performer. I don't know if they're still around. You could use Pro Tools for it as well too. But Mixcraft is super affordable. It's like $100. And like I said, you buy the MIDI keyboard for $100 and you're off and running. Then if you want to be able to do DVDs and Blu-rays, you're going to need some authoring software. And this is where it gets a little sketchy. As far as I know, at the time of this recording, you cannot buy good authoring software anymore. It doesn't exist. They've all closed up shop. The most recent one that was still available was DVD Architect, and I've been using them for almost over 20 years now too myself. And I've been through all their different versions, but even that's no longer available. However, you might be able to find it through some questionable means on certain sites and stuff like that. I don't condone it. I'm not saying you should do it, but I'm saying if you absolutely need to make physical media, the software is no longer around. So is it really illegal anymore? I don't know. That's a moral compass question for yourself to have to ask, but just know that that is an option for you. And if you're going to do that, then you also need to make sure that you have a burner as well. You're going to want to make sure you get a Blu-ray burner and that can burn Blu-rays and DVDs so you can go through and test them first before you send off your masters to a site like Kuniki to get your stuff manufactured. And then other little just random pieces of software that I find extremely useful. Free file sync, we've already talked about. To handle my ingest, when I have a full memory card and I want to offload to my computer, I use a program called Terracopy. It's the version I'm using is free, and it allows you to have checksum verification, which basically makes sure that every single bit and byte of data is transferred without any errors and without any corruption. You can use the media page of DaVinci to do this as well too, but what I noticed on my feature was that as the hard drives were getting more and more full with storage, the media page transfer was taking longer and longer and longer, and I don't know why that is. And so I did some research, and halfway through the shoot, I switched to Terracopy to handle my ingest, and I absolutely love it. So Terracopy is awesome. Another good little handy app to have is called Seer, S-E-E-R, and this allows you to mimic the quick preview that you find on Mac. So on a Mac, and most Mac users will know this, if you click on an image and hit spacebar, it loads a preview of that image real quick. You can also quickly audition an audio file or quickly watch one of your video files. It lets you just quickly see what the stuff is. And Seer for Windows allows you to do the same thing. It's a small, lightweight app, just a couple of megabytes. And same thing, hit spacebar, boop, brings up a preview. Another really good one, this is something not a lot of people think about. So when you're doing a film, you're going to encounter long render times where you're trying to export a cut of your film or you've got a visual effect shot that's rendering and rendering and rendering, and it might take 18 hours to render through all that animation. Well, you don't want to have your monitors, your LCD screens, get burned in because that can happen. That is still very much a real thing. And so you want to turn off your monitor. Well, now the problem is if you want to check on it, now you've got to turn your monitor back on, and sometimes that can screw with your system. And windows are going to start appearing in different places around your screen or on the wrong monitor. And there are, in rare instances, chances that it can crash whatever software you're running if you're trying to flip it on and off to check on the progress of it. So, again, I did some research on this, and I found a free app called Screen Off, all one word, Screenoff. And what this allows you to do is when you launch the app, it just kills your monitors, but it leaves them powered on. And so if I ever want to just quickly check on something, then I just hit the control key or any key or move my mouse, and the computers just come back to life. So all it does is puts the monitor to sleep without putting your computer to sleep, and it doesn't disconnect the monitor from your system like turning it off would do. So this is a way to protect the longevity of your screens, but still have a lot of quick access to your stuff to check in on your renders and all that good stuff. So Screen Off, really, really cool. It doesn't even have to install. It's a standalone app that you download. So I just stick mine in my applications folder, and then I create a shortcut to it that I pin to my status bar next to my start menu. Let's see, Media Info, again, all one word. Great little app for finding out details about your clips and stuff. I use it all the time when I'm trying to figure out why didn't this work the way I wanted it to? Was it my compression? Is it the color space? Is it the codec I'm using? Like whatever. And so Media Info, again, you can find it on Mac and Windows. Just gives you all that data and all that information that you want. And then really important is talking about the maintenance of your computer. And to transition in that, we'll talk about maintenance software. On Windows, WinDirStat, WinDirStat. On Mac, it's called Disk Inventory X. These tools allow you to scan your entire hard drive, and they map every single file that's on your drive. And they tell you in a graphical way how big your files are and everything is color coded by type as well. So at a glance, you can quickly see, oh, my system applications are taking up more space than this, or my footage is taking up way more space than this, or oh my gosh, look at all these cache files I got over here. And it allows you to then just go through and quickly delete, those little temp caches and stuff like that to free up space on your computer. Really, really critical, especially if you're on a laptop, for managing everything and making sure that you constantly have enough space to do the work that you're wanting and trying to do. So Windorstat and Disk Inventory X for either Windows or Mac. Now, talking about maintenance and housekeeping with your computers. I go through at least once every 3 months. I turn my computer off, I unplug it, I take it outside, and I have an air compressor, or you can use a can of air, and I blow the snot out of it because it's collected dust from 3 months of work. Those fans that are keeping the thing cool are constantly sucking in all the dust in your room. And if you've got a dog like I do, well, guess what? You're probably gonna have even more dust and maybe some fur even that gets added into it. No matter how hard you try to keep things clean, it's always gonna happen. So I blow it all out. I go through and I wipe everything down with a static free rag. I wipe the case down as well. I clean my monitors. I clean my desk, my keyboard. This is a good time to sanitize your keyboard and mouse. And what it means is that every 3 months, it feels like a new computer again. And I go through and I run my Windorstat or Disk Inventory X on the Mac, and I go through and just everything is good to go, and I just give that little bit of a refresh. I clean up my desktop. If my desktop is starting to accumulate too much junk, which I generally try not to do, but if it's starting to, I'll go through, I clean it up. And this is the secret to making a computer last forever. This is how I was able to do Leap Rise of the Beast back in 2011 on a computer that was 8 years old. You know, I cut that movie offline, and we can talk about offline online in another program, but I did an offline edit. We'd shot it on full HD on a Canon Rebel T2i, but the computer had 2 gigs of RAM and a single core Celeron processor and no graphics card. And so I had to, by keeping the computer clean and running fast and efficiently like this, it was actually able to handle the film through the offline process. All right, I think that wraps this little talk up. I hope this gives you some food for thought and some things to chew on. Again, this was all focused on the post-production side. There's other software I run too on my computers, especially on my laptop when I'm writing. So I've got my Final Draft, I've got Freeform, I've got, my business stuff like QuickBooks and things. You got a calendar, I got my scheduling app, which we'll talk about in another episode. So there is other tools and software that I use, but for post-production, the stuff I rattle off, that's what gets me through the day. And it's just stuff I found over the years that is very much a necessity, and you don't realize how much you need it until you don't have it. So, wrapping this up, thank you so much for listening. My name is Christopher Temple, and you've been listening to Indie Rebel, the podcast for independent filmmakers.